Hello, listeners. It's me, Tomebinder. I'm doing something a little bit different today. We're starting a new podcast that's focused on the Steam Wars universe, which is a project that began in Ancient Warfare 3 and has since taken on even greater form as a collaborative writing project, a shared universe. So, this podcast is hopefully going to serve to untangle it a little bit so new people can understand the story and we can have a really fun community of world builders originating from Ancient Warfare 3. But again, I am Tomebinder. I've been a member of this community for a while, and I'm writing some books taking place in the universe. But I'm not the only one on this podcast. I'm joined by.
I'm Eagle. I'm the longtime host and one of a handful of creators of the Steam Wars or the Soul Wars, which is the writing project, and I'm very glad to be on this podcast. Tomebinder has been a great contributor to the setting and is currently embarking on probably one of the greatest writing feats that it has ever seen in the form of the book. So
I am
it's
super
going to be
proud
great
of
to
it.
talk
I
about
would say
this.
it's the project I'm most proud of. Just full stop in my literary career, at least in a hobby sort of perspective. The thing I just taken on and decided to do, a mountain I decided to create and then climb. I'm really
Yeah,
excited for the books.
there's a lot of anticipation for it among
Yeah.
the community.
But let me be
And
very
hopefully,
clear.
great,
Very
hopefully even
excited?
greater
I'm
anticipation
excited.
once we get to the podcast there.
I'm going to turn you up a little bit and turn you down in the recording. Okay. What were you saying? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, hopefully the anticipation is even greater once we get the podcast out and people
Yeah.
hopefully listen and find stuff out about the setting.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, that's one of the things, one of the reasons I wanted to make this was we were talking in the Soul Wars Discord, and one of the members, Harvey, mentioned he's excited to read the books, but he doesn't really. He's going to be dropped in without any sort of context, and it's not going to make very much sense. So, the podcast hopefully will demystify the setting because there's a lot to explain. It's very dense. It's like Game of Thrones, but sci-fi. That's what I'd call it. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a pretty good description of it with it's very a lot of political intrigue. I mean, just on the wiki alone, we have currently 4,416 pages.
just just astronomical, and there's so many more, hundreds if not thousands, waiting to be made, and more to be made
Yeah,
after the books come out. It's gonna be pretty massive, in the words of Ninja. It's gonna be pretty massive. But so yeah, so it is sort of like sci-fi Game of Thrones in some ways, but I've taken lots of different influences from lots of different places, which we can talk about our influences too, because not only is this a podcast about the story of Steam Wars, but it's also kind of a meta podcast explaining the process of world building and how we tackle it. So it'll be interesting once we start talking about these arcs that are taking place in this world. It'll be interesting to peel back the curtain a little bit and talk about how we constructed the arcs, what inspired us, etc. I'm going to be a little bit cagey, especially about book plot points. Like, I'm not going to reveal what's to come, but there'll still be a lot of hopefully good insights people can glean if they want to join Steam Wars and contribute to this setting, because again, it's collaborative.
yeah, and obviously we always welcome new members and anyone who wants to contribute or even just read about the setting because it's always great to have more people actually interested in it.
Yeah, and again, I really hope that's if this podcast can get just one person interested in Soul Wars, I'll consider it a success, frankly. And even if it doesn't get anyone interested, even if it just helps people like Harvey and Vapor or even Pineapple understand just more of what's going on, because the more you understand, I think the more you appreciate. I certainly get so much out of it, being so uh, knowledgeable about the lore.
Yeah, just well, I guess that's probably enough about our hopes for the podcast. But I'm sure our listeners are excited to hear about the podcast itself.
Certainly, yeah, okay. We've got open, or at least I do, the main page of the Steam Wars wiki, which, by the way, is
As do
public.
I.
We're gonna go through the arcs one at a time and bring people up to speed. Or maybe we should start with, I think we mentioned before we started recording the idea, we'd start with sort of a broad strokes history of the setting, and as we get closer to the present day and the arcs that will actually be explored in the books, then we start talking about things in more detail. Is that cool with you still? Do you want to do something
Yeah.
like that? All right.
No, that works for me.
Friggin' sweet. Okay. I think maybe you should start with the general, like, the world's the history of the world from the Big Bang to now. Except it's not exactly, it's
We haven't gotten that far behind in the
yeah,
history, I guess.
exactly.
Uh, okay. So the vast majority of the current writing exists around the planet Ulia, which exists basically as an equivalent to our real-world Earth.
Mm-hmm.
It has 4 continents, and you have different species across the different continents. The world follows a generally equivalent uh, technological pace to ours. The current year is 2200, and the technology is generally around what we might have in that time frame. But more or less, the years of the Soul Wars are equivalent to the years in our own world in terms of cultural and technological development.
Mm-hmm.
But you have very different histories for all of the different continents. A lot of them share many interactions, but they have very divergent paths, and you have a great multitude of different cultural groups within each continent, and a lot of those cultural groups are now they've now become part of the wider ongoing conflict.
Yeah, there's no. I think a good way for people to think about it is there's no Europe stand-in,
Mm-hmm.
America's stand-in, Asia stand-in. Um, Actually, earlier in the setting, there was more of that. It was more of a direct, real-world parallel. But we've taken
We've moved
massive
away from that.
pains to, yeah, make the setting is super unique. Um, but yeah, there's just so much to explore. So you mentioned Ulia, the third planet from the sun. Do you want to talk about like the different planets and stuff? Could be
Yeah,
kind of
there is.
cool.
Uh, it is the year 2200, so space travel has been a thing for the past 2 centuries, and the rest of the planets of the system are more or less home to various different colonies and independent nations, some of which are fiercely independent and others of which are still connected to their the nations or companies or organizations that settled them. None of the other planets harbor any sentient life. Some of them have plant life native to the environments, but Ulia is the only place in the system to actually be home to any yeah, sentient life, I guess, and civilizations.
Indigenous like civilizations. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's in that Goldilocks zone, and the system is called the Aurelian system because that's the name of the sun in this world is Aurelia, or Aurelia. I say Aurelia, but you know, it's
well, it's mostly written down, so I guess it's up to you. I've always been partial to Aurelia,
hmm.
but it doesn't
Okay.
really matter.
Okay, well, I'll think about it. I'll start saying it more. That's another reason I like the podcast too, because we'll be able to sound
Actually
out a lot of
vocalize a
these.
lot of these for the first time.
Yeah, yeah. That's why it was satisfying. We recently had a conversation, mostly through voice notes in the Soul Wars Discord.
Oh
So
yeah.
that was a lot of fun. But yeah, I think about this setting as I've used this phrase before: fantasy thrust into a sci-fi world, because this
Definitely.
is like a near future, 200 years from now, sci-fi, people living on different planets, but it's not just humans. Would you care to explain what's going on there?
Yeah, we have actually, I believe, what, 5 or 6 species,
Oh
sentient
gosh, let me
species.
think. There's
Is that right?
I think I can think of three.
We have so humans are they still exist. They're probably the most populous and dominant species across settled space. But there are elves, which are uh, similar to your typical high fantasy Tolkien-esque elves. Very long-living, very cautious because of that. They're closely related to humans. And then you have the Petuliac, who are sort of similar to dwarves. They live underground, but they are blind and are very pale because they have they don't, no sunlight reaches them underground. So they're very physically different from humans, besides just being shorter.
Yeah,
So they're pretty different from what you would normally expect from like a Tolkien-esque dwarf.
the pale men, and of course there's regional differences in the Petuliac as well, which we mentioned after I posted a book sample. But yeah,
Oh yeah,
Lovecraftian almost inspirations there for me when I
definitely.
write about them. There's also the Faleshi, which were a very powerful warlike species that venerates the sun, Aurelia, and they used to be much more prominent across the continents, but their empire has fallen, so now they're sort of minority communities around the world. And then, talking it out, there's also the Kiva, who you should talk about. The Kiva and the Cyrenesh.
Yes. So the Kiva, or the Alessi, as they're
Right,
more commonly known,
right.
um, are humanoid bird folk. So they are humanoid, bipedal, so similar to humans in that way, but they have a lot of more avian traits as well. And they were the dominant species in one of the four continents on Ulia, Eridan, until the arrival of humans. I don't know, probably around what, like the 3000 uh,
The B.
BDR,
Okay, yeah.
which is uh, equivalent to our world's BCE or BC. I guess we can get into that, but maybe we
Yeah.
should stick to the basics for now.
Yeah, I think we've made reference to Eridan. And by the way, in case anyone was wondering, the Cyrenesh are lizard people, so we'll talk more about them later.
Yeah.
But we mentioned Eridan, so we should probably now. I'll throw up a visual of the map of the world, and maybe if you want to open that one up quick, I'll open one up as well. Yeah, there is so much to dig into with this map. I think we should try to not overwhelm the audience.
Yeah,
Let's break it down by
because there's
continent,
definitely a
perhaps.
lot.
Yeah.
I guess we can just talk about what, like, the main powers of the current world.
Yeah. I think we should go by continent and talk a little bit about it. And sure, yeah, talk about the main nations. Where should we start? I don't want to start with Helinska. I think there's the most to say about that one.
Yeah, I guess Eridan's probably one of the simpler ones.
Yeah. Okay. Let's zero in on that. You know more about that one than me, so take it away.
Okay, well, so the issue with Eridan is a lot of its story is currently being reworked, but the major power there is the Central Eridanese Federation, which is a sort of regionalist transnational federation of a bunch of different, very culturally distinct nations, sometimes of cross species. So you have different human and bird folk countries within it, all unified under a single government.
So kind of like
And
like a
they're
European Federation sort of vibe.
Yeah, exactly. And so
Because
they're by
yeah,
far the biggest power on the continent.
are they also the largest single nation besides the ICO on the planet? It looks like they are.
I think they are. Maybe only second to Pulmaria.
Yeah, Polmaria's right up there. Hmm.
Or yeah, I think, but I believe they are the largest singular nation.
They look huge because they have the contiguous borders,
Yeah,
whereas Polmaria has some map painting going on. But anyway. Yeah, the
uh,
CEF. They're interesting.
yeah,
I think we can talk more about them in the context of the Cold War, the interplanetary Cold War,
which
and
is the
their role in
big
that.
story arc, or one of the main story
Yeah,
arc going on right now.
I guess we should zip through the continents and get over to that, maybe.
Kalshe is the easternmost continent. It is primarily islands. It's pretty sparse right now because during the 2000s, many of them sank after rising tides. It used to be home to one of the largest colonial empires in the world, Aerolia, but they collapsed around the early 1900s, and ever since then, it's been only marginally important, I guess,
Hmm.
in the context of wider international
A
politics.
shadow of what it once was. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, Aurelia loomed large in the history of this planet back in the day, but maybe perhaps they're trying to reclaim some of their status with the interplanetary Cold War here.
possible.
Um, because I know at least there are some interestingly placed Aerolian leaders uh, right now. Like there's the guy in Valoran, the leader of Irenic Dawn, I think is Aerolian. So, anyways, we'll get into that
Oh,
later. Yeah,
okay.
Avery Vez
Oh, yeah,
Altyke.
you're right.
So,
I believe he's from Wadelistan, which is,
oh,
but that's an Aeolian colony.
okay. Well, cool.
So still, like, a lot of Aeolian cultural influence there.
Yeah, yeah. I
Anyway,
really love maps. I'm looking forward to making a billion maps of the different time periods of this world,
oh,
so we can
definitely.
show the Aurelian Empire at its greatest extent. But
Yes.
that, oh gosh, that's gonna be so fun. And I'm also gonna do a hyper detailed map of one of the continents. Anyways, getting off track.
Wonderful.
Then,
I guess Marilau is next,
yes, to the north.
which is, that one's, ooh, I feel like that's on a, or at least it should be on an equivalent level as Helinska in detail compared to the other two, since it's home to so many vastly different cultures and major faiths.
Yeah, yeah,
Like the split between West and East Marilau, sort of divided by Azarkan in the middle there, they're basically two completely different continents in terms of the people living there.
yeah. I'm seeing. I don't know very much about Marilau. They feature not very much in the first book. I'm seeing a lot of blue on the eastern half of Marilau. This might be a good
Yeah.
time to explain the blue and pink on the right side of the continent.
So the blue are nations who are member states of the Interstellar Cooperation Organization, or the ICO as it is more commonly known, which you can think of as a. It was once basically this world's version of the United Nations, and then throughout the 2000s, and in the 1960s as well, it gained a lot of influence and power and sort of independence from the nations which it represented. And by the current year, it has grown to be a political power in its own right and sort of a supranational federation of hundreds of different countries across Ulia.
And it's stricken by ideological battles over to what extent those nations should unify into a truly international thing. To what extent should
Yeah,
national identity be subordinate, or should it be a weak, decentralized thing? Uh,
it's a very unstable coalition.
it really is, which benefits their main rival, the pink there, Polmaria. That is a colony there in Marilau, a colony of the nation of Polmaria, which we'll talk a lot more about soon. But Polmaria is, I'm going to say this, and maybe the guy who created Polmaria will disagree with me, but it sort of sits at the head of another alliance, the main rival of the ICO, and that's called the Aurelian Senate. So the Aurelian Senate, the AS, also officially called the Aurelian Senate Organization, or the ASO, and that stands in contrast to the ICO. So ICO, ASO, they're more similar than they care to admit, which leads to many problems. They both want to be the preeminent power in this solar system, and it's created an enormous interplanetary Cold War on the verge of imploding at the time of the book's start. But we should talk more about that with Helinska. Is there anything more to say with Marilau at the moment?
I think there's a lot more we could say, but I think we should save that for like a deep dive.
Okay, yeah, I do think that continent could get its own video. I think Eridan could get its own video once the rework is done as well.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to Helinska. What is there to say about this iconic continent, this half of the map?
I mean, there's so much you could say. With a lot of these continents, there's a lot of different places and a lot of names, but the actual like history and internal divisions within them, like all of the cultures and all that, doesn't really go much beyond a surface level. With Helinska, I'm pretty sure almost every country on this continent has a very detailed history.
Yes.
So there's a lot we could say about it, but I think we'll save it for another time. It is the seat of power for both the the Aurelian Senate and the ISO.
I would consider it this sort of heartland of the planet. That's where a lot of the main battles for supremacy between the blue ICO and the pink Aurelian Senate take place. They
Definitely.
are like a Cold War struggle to get puppets and pawns in this massive game of chess in Helinska, because the ICO is headquartered right here, and the Aurelian Senate is headquartered right there. So it's very it's a kettle that's close to boiling over. That's how I describe it.
Yeah, for sure.
But those are the continents. I don't know. I do want to talk a lot and dive into all these continents, but especially Helinska, because there's a lot of work. I put in a lot of work for that one, and the lore is going to get even multiple times deeper when the books come out for these nations in particular. So,
which I'm very excited for.
But yeah, so those are the continents. Of course, this world, as Eagle briefly touched on, has experienced extreme climate issues at multiple points in its history. So the map didn't used to look like this. In fact, it's like traumatic. It's climate disasters have hit this world and changed the borders. So if you want to elaborate on that.
Oh yeah. So there was, like, throughout the 2000s, a lot of this planet industrialized earlier than our world did, and in multiple places at once, so it was more spread out than just a singular continent. So by the early 2000s, the world was already sort of collapsing ecologically. So by, I don't know, the 2060s or so, you started to see some pretty major rises in the sea level, which had pretty disastrous effects on a lot of the countries across the world, and sometimes a lot of religious implications. As generally the period from 2000 to 2100 was a pretty calamitous time for pretty much the whole planet.
Yeah, definitely. And that era deserves its own video as well, Verdant Blade, we will discuss in great detail, because I think it's very, very cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's the world, and we've mentioned, of course, that there's settlements and nations and colonies on more than just this planet. But this is the most important planet to start with, because it is the cradle of life, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would like to touch on the rest of the solar system, but I think we could probably handle all of that in a separate video.
Okay, I mean, we could go through it like with just sort of briefly now and talk more about the planets in their own video, But it's probably good for people to understand.
Like Ulia is good enough. It's the heart of almost all of the major struggles right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or a lot of them, I guess.
Yeah, the majority. Which makes sense because, there's a lot of time for pent-up struggles and conflicts and rivalries to build. Which reminds me of a cool thing I want to talk to you about, but I'm not going to talk to you about it now because it would be too much going on for the listener. I'm excited to explore the
eagerly
planets.
awaited.
I need to write this down, actually. No, I'm not. I'll just remember it. I'm just going to remember it.
Surely.
Right, yeah. Maybe not. I can write it down in my 300 and... Let me see. It's loading. I have a massive notes document for this universe, and it's over 300 pages long. It's loading
So
in.
insane. I don't know how you, manage all of it. How you have the time.
Headers. Yep, I have a very intuitive system of headers so I can skip around in it. The document is 339 pages long, and I just imported some new notes from my notebook today, so... Okay. We'll talk about the planets more in another video, like going through like a tour of the Aurelian system.
Yeah, I think that'd be fun to go through.
Yeah. But I think
Or
now...
at least interesting.
Yeah. Well, we need people to understand these things for the books.
Yeah.
Because they do cover they take you on an odyssey across multiple planets, through the stars. Yeah. So can we talk about the arcs now, or the history of the world and
the actual story?
Zero in on the arcs. So, okay, maybe I'll get started and then I'll just let you, we can just go back and forth if that works.
Yeah. I'll just jump in if I have anything to add.
Right, please do. You're welcome to. So this world is called Soul Wars, but it didn't used to be called that. It was originally called Coal Wars because the original round of writing in this universe was set in an 1800s, I believe.
Yeah.
Sort of.
It was 1804.
Era, so muskets and the Napoleonic type era. That didn't last very long. People started developing a little bit, and then we moved on to, was it called Steam Wars with Round 1?
It was. Both rounds 1 and 2 were called the Steam Wars.
Okay, so we went from a brief sort of proto-period with Coal Wars to Steam Wars, which was a writing, or more of a Ancient Warfare 3 map-making contest that I just happened to have writing on the side. And
yeah,
that covered exclusively the continent of Helenska. So when we say there's a lot of lore behind this continent, that's because previous iterations of this project took place only in Helenska. So we've spent a lot of time adding, gluing layer after layer after layer of lore on top of it. During the Steam Wars, it covered the clashes of empires, this very important period of time when the continent was mostly unified behind mega states, and they were so militarized, and they had these disputes, these border disputes, and pent up hatred of each other, that just a world war was inevitable. So the continent was consumed by war between Pulmaria, which still exists to this day. Remember that name. It was Pulmaria and Aerolia, the empire which you mentioned earlier, and a few other states. There was the Ionian Empire, the Holy Monarchy in the northwest, and John, the Socialist Republic of John.
The funny part is, at this point, I've been with that name for so long that it doesn't even sound weird to me anymore.
But it is weird.
Yeah, I just kind of think about that.
Yeah. That's the case for a lot of these names. I remember originally being what the heck's with these names? Palmaria, Astavara, Valeron. Well, now I love them, and I hope the listeners will love them in time, too. But the point is...
In time.
With enough episodes, we'll see. Stick with it, guys.
Surely.
So there was the Steam Wars. Those took place at the turn of the 1900s, but in 1906, the feuding empires, were interrupted mid-war by a rudely timed climate apocalypse called the Cataclysm, which caused massive flooding, earthquakes, just the absolute works. A river in the continent called the Laren River overflowed, and now it's a big channel, and so lots of destruction causing the fall of most of the nations involved in that first Great War. So that was a natural stopping point for that iteration of the project. And we had another round after that, round two, that explored the 1930s and how these nations sort of found their feet again, and in the aftermath of this climate disaster, began to reestablish national identities, ideologies, agendas, and coming to blows again in the second round of Steam Wars. And eventually that culminated in a period called the War of the End Times, it was known as.
Oh yeah. Oh, so we're getting into oil wars now.
That's right, there was Oil Wars. Oh, the names, man. I don't even think about them in terms of the rounds anymore. I think about it as one unbroken world, so I don't remember what's coal, steam, and oil. But yeah.
Each round has gotten progressively more focused on the writing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Round one there was some writing. But it was primarily done just through talking between the players, and it was mostly about the conflicts. And then round two, you really saw the explosion of writing, which is why things were a little, I guess, wackier in that period.
Yes.
There's a lot to talk about from there. That's just kind of.
We've brushed it under the rug. The early Wild West days when we were transitioning into more of a writing project, and anyone with a keyboard could contribute. So, interesting things to talk about then. But we won't do it now.
That was the 1950s, and
Yes.
that was when you had the rest of the planet Ulia, besides Helinska, get introduced.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a pretty big expansion in the lore. That was, I guess, sort of the last time we had, or the last hurrah of the sort of Ancient Warfare 3 war-based aspects of the setting, which culminated, like Tomebinder was saying, in the War of the End Times.
Which was really the period that saw, obviously not the end of the setting, but I do like that name because it does signal an end to the old era of the world. That showing the rise of the ICO, like that war is what really cemented and turned the ICO into the transnational power that it is to this day. That war also saw the fall of the Socialist Republic of John, which was a holdout from years prior, and also saw the temporary weakening of Polmaria, which created resentment and sort of sowed the seeds that would be reaped much later by Polmaria's resurgence and hatred for the ICO. So that was a really cool period, the War of the End Times. Took place in the 1950s and 60s. There was going to be a Ancient Warfare 3 campaign depicting it, but if you can believe it, I was still working on Good of the Company Paradigm Shift at the time. Like that was a really long development period cycle, and it just would have been too much. But we've played around with the idea of resurrecting a campaign for this, like returning to our roots as Ancient Warfare 3 content creators, not just writers.
I think it would be a cool visual addition to the setting and help our dear listeners visit the setting more personally.
Yeah. So maybe look forward to that in the coming months / years. To be honest, we'll see.
Yeah.
But that was the end of that round, and we skipped from that. Like, the next iteration of the setting was in 2194, I think. Like, we skipped ahead 250 years. or 200... Well, hold on. Yeah, almost 250 years.
It ended in 1959, I think, round 3.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, basically 250 years.
So that was the biggest time skip we had done.
Yeah.
and there's just less stuff happening, obviously. So the timeline is not as filled out for that period, but that's okay. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about earlier. It's an interesting exploration of the idea of the end of history. Like, if you are familiar with that concept,
Hmm.
it's like the end of history in this world was the end of the War of the End Times, and so there's been petty conflicts of the succeeding 250 years, but they've really it's like there's been a collective holding of breath by society, and people turn deeper and deeper into the past the further you get into the future, and resurrect old grievances and sources of conflict, and they want some outlet to use all their militarization and hatred on. So like this, we're coming out of the end of history by the time the books begin. So that's
You
something I'm
mentioned
playing with.
going so far into the future, people start looking into the past, and I think no nation exemplifies that better than the Canorian Empire,
Oh, I would say
which was
so.
the only absolute monarchy on Ulia that still remained by 2194. And it was widely considered, I don't know, not a backwater necessarily, but something of a pariah state.
Yes.
It didn't have much diplomatic weight.
Mm-mm.
And by 2194, it had, throughout the throughout its history, from when it was first created in the 1950s, it had various liberal and conservative periods. By the beginning of the current round of Soul Wars, it was in its most conservative period yet, and it was set on reclaiming its lost territories that it governed hundreds of years prior.
Yes, the fraternal idea. Everything in
Mm-hmm.
everything in Central Helinska is esoterically related through genetic witchcraft. It's all one people and one land, and Canorians governed various large parts of that region in antiquity, and so this empire was dead set on reclaiming what it saw as its rightful territories, which had been independent of it since the 1970s. So, like
With
the
some exceptions.
yeah, it's an interesting situation because if we're are we is this so this is our segue into the Canorian crisis essentially. We're,
Yeah, because that's kind of the Canorian crisis was the stepping stone to pretty much everything that is currently happening.
the immediate the immediate prelude to the current conflict. It's what set everything up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was so one of the regions that Canoria held was a country now called Laronia. None of these places are on the map. We might want to pull up like an older map for the viewers or
Yes, I
something
will do
to
that.
put on
I'm
screen.
looking for one right now.
I think there was one on the wiki, maybe.
Oh yeah,
Anyway,
okay. I've got some. I got one up right now.
okay, great. So, one of the territories that Canoria once governed was called Laronia, and that was a nation situated on the Laron Channel.
Hence the name.
And yeah, and anyway, it had been independent off and on since the 1970s, but there had always been a large Canorian minority in the south of the nation, and so there was always an undercurrent of Canorian nationalism within the country who advocated reunifying with Canoria, and of course a lot of that was propped up by the Canorian state itself. And by 2194, with the failure of those groups to actually achieve reunification, Canoria ended up resorting to military means to seize control of the country. But Laronia was backed by the ICO, which, along with Pulmaria and the Aurelian Senate, was one of the most major political power players on the planet. So this invasion of a much smaller country ended up blossoming into the most major conflict on the planet in years, and it involved pretty much every major power, and including some powers from other planets as well, that spread to the very furthest regions of the system.
Yeah, pretty insane. The reverberations that they had. They thought it would be an easy conquest, or some people did. Dreyer probably knew all along it wasn't gonna be. Well, I think I give Dreyer too much
It
credit, but
it would have been an easy victory if he just took the helm.
so true, so true. It would have been the man for the job ending from the video. But yeah, so they invaded Laronia. It's kind of insane. Like, it's just the Canorian Empire is really, for me, an interesting examination of how people like how states delude themselves and how authoritarian states never work. It's not just
Mhm.
that they're morally bad, but they can't function after a time. They eat themselves in trying to sustain themselves. Like, there's always got to be an enemy, and if there's an enemy, you got to fight them. In theory, if you
Mhm.
fight them, you lose. So interesting.
I believe there was a great line from one of your earliest writings for the Canorian Empire, which was their leader, uh, sort of their de facto leader. Uh, is it Ingle? It's Engelbert von
Engelbert
Bosch.
is the father. Yeah.
I confuse him and his son Engelhard sometimes.
Yes.
But Engelbert, it was a line, I still remember it. The most decorated military general in Canoria, but this was itself an irony because Canoria, or the most decorated general in living memory, but this was itself an irony because Canoria had fought no wars in living memory.
Yes.
So it was sort of it was a state that viewed itself as this great custodian of most of some of the greatest lands in the continent, and yet was generally considered a regional power at best by
Mm-hmm.
everyone around it. And that led to this catastrophic war that ended up leading to the complete partitioning of the country between two foreign occupation zones.
Yeah. Which is, of course, the overlapping border claims that stem from the fall of the empire are just insane, and they deserve a whole video of their own.
Yeah, the Hackenhar conference that tried to negotiate a peace settlement could definitely have its own video. There were
Mm-hmm.
so many different proposals and negotiating points.
Definitely. The Canorian Empire is cool because that incongruity between how they saw themselves and the rest of the world saw them is an interesting psychological examination of, propaganda and how states delude themselves or try to delude their people even if they know it's not true. So
Hmm. And I think to some extent, if you spend so long trying to uh, delude your people into thinking this way, and you have all of your ministers as sycophants and yes men who are agreeing with it, you end up deluding the very highest echelons of leadership into believing it as well.
which is ultimately exactly what happened to the last emperor, Jeremias, who is a very interesting name we can explain, but it happened to him. He basically, at least for all intents and purposes, from what we've seen of him, he believes his own hype essentially that 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 he deserves to annex these lands, that
Hmm.
his government, mind you, his imperial dynasty allowed them to become independent in the 1970s. And it's now the 2100s, sure, but nothing about that document changed. They didn't.
Yeah.
So, anyway, the Canorian Empire mobilized a large amount of forces, more so like an unprecedented amount in living memory again. And it just didn't. They first went west, actually. They didn't attack Lironia first. They annexed almost bloodlessly a neighboring country called Valoron because that country was largely depopulated as a result of a religious exodus off planet, and Canoria really wanted the extra land for their people and stuff to sort of make it an integral territory of their empire.
And interestingly, that annexation was actually sanctioned by the ICO.
Mm-hmm. And there's many
which,
reasons why. If you wanted to go into it, that is interesting to think about. But
yeah, retroactively, I've kind of had to think about why they would do that, just allowing Canoria to just annex a country.
yeah,
But it does have some historical precedent with the ICO's whole doctrine of there being a responsibility for a country to protect its citizens. And so if a country is not able to do that, then either other countries or the ICO itself have not only the right but the duty to intervene and then take up the responsibility for those to protect those citizens.
that's very
So
cool.
Canoria was actually acting fully under international law in its reannexation there.
Yeah, that's
But
really
then,
interesting to think
despite
about.
that, the ICO has actually sort of it's retroactively rescinded its support for Canorian reannexation and basically acted like it was a breach of international law and voided it.
Even though, of course, they were okay with it at first.
Yeah,
They thought they would just stop in Valoron.
they basically used the entire country as a bargaining chip to try and get influence in Canoria,
And that's
which
cool.
ultimately failed.
Yeah, of course. They probably didn't anticipate Canoria would set its sights on tougher targets, essentially.
Yeah. Before the actual invasion, there was a whole period of posturing and the ICO attempting to get Canoria to back down by through a by threatening blockades and sanctions and that sort of thing, while not actually deploying troops to Laronia itself in an effort to de-escalate tensions. That was its prevailing ideology,
Yeah.
because I believe at the time the current government was very staunchly anti-interventionist.
Hmm.
So they were trying to use as little military force as possible to dissuade the conflict. And then it didn't work, and Canoria invaded Laronia. So then you had one of the ICO's most major allies being invaded and falling in a matter of months.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty huge blow to the ICO's reputation. And then you had Pomaria, which bordered Laronia, end up liberating most of the country, which was an even worse blow to the ICO's reputation.
Certainly, there's not very much blue on that map. In the wake of the war, the ICO didn't get very much of the former Canorian Empire because, they simply put, they were beat to the punch by Pulmaria and its
Mm-hmm.
Aurelian Senate forces. It was a sort of bold, risky paratrooper operation that gave the ICO some land, but it's very isolated, of course, as it was an aerial landing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the Canorian Empire let's just summarize the crisis for the listeners at home. Would you like to
Yeah.
summarize, and I can flesh out anything necessary? But
Sure. So we've already gone over Laronia. You had Canoria. They militarized and they took over. It was a brutal invasion, but it was a pretty decisive Canorian victory. Some insurgencies persisted, but they weren't able to do anything significant without foreign involvement. Then you had Canoria really bite off more than it can chew, which it had already bitten off more than it could chew, really, since it was at war with pretty much the entire world. It was like, the Gulf War, with the coalition defending Kuwait and Laronia being Kuwait.
yeah, it's an interesting way to
But
look at it.
then you have I guess you have Canoria not only invading the sort of Kuwait, but then you have them declaring war on basically the entire EU as well,
Mm-hmm.
which they do by invading neighboring Kwesi, which is a Pulmarian riverine state directly bordering Laronia. And this invasion actually goes surprisingly well for them initially, and they make enormous ground, but eventually Pulmaria's military catches up with them, and they are pushed out of Kwesi and then pushed out of Laronia, and they managed to hold them back for a time, for around a year, before Ionia, which borders to the south of Canoria, they militarize, and then Canoria is just completely subsumed.
And all while this is happening, there's uprisings against the Empire in its western
Mm-hmm.
provinces, and it's getting invaded from the west by ICO paratroopers and stuff, so it's really
Yeah.
embattled on all fronts.
So then, by the end of the crisis, you have most of the Western Empire under the control of the ICO, or its allies in Astavara, and then you have most of the East under the control of Pulmaria and its allies in Ionia. So the victorious powers of the coalition meet in a city called Hakenhar to discuss the post-war peace agreement, and the ICO's vision is basically just to return to the status quo before the war, except with a semi-constitutional monarchy or maybe a republic in Canoria. And, I don't know, presumably a liberated Valoran, or maybe a provisional government there.
I'm looking up the official map.
Yeah, and then you have on the other end the Pulmarian submission, which is basically a completely dismembered Canoria, which makes sense since you had a Pulmaria invade Canoria invade Pulmaria directly and commit many atrocities. So you had Pulmaria wanting to destroy the idea of a Canorian state altogether, so they could never do that again.
Then they created some pretty monstrous borders to really keep the Canorian people, divided and unable to pose a threat ever again. And it seems like the ICO thought that would be too much. It could lead to a backlash and a rise of some, like some sort of Hitler figure who calls upon the anger of the defeated Canorians, and is an even greater threat. That's sort of how I read it.
Because, importantly, Canoria, like the nations that Pulmaria was attempting to create out of the ashes of the Canorian Empire, were culturally and linguistically identical.
Yeah, they had no reason to be separate. Like, there's no reason for their borders to be where they were.
And then you had the annexations of much of southern Canoria into Ionia, which is linguistically and culturally very similar to Canoria. They have some minor differences, but they are, by and large, a very similar people.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not completely far-fetched, but the ICO viewed it as an outrage, just the idea of outright annexations as punishment for losing a war. They viewed it as a completely antiquated form of settlement, and so they just rejected the Aurelian Senate's proposal outright. And then, obviously, Pulmaria and the Aurelian Senate did the same to the ICOs. So by the end of the war, you have no agreement on how to handle the occupation zones, so they just stay. And then both sides recognize their own proposal as the legal one. And you have the beginning of the Cold War, which, if you would like to go into more detail on.
Certainly, yeah, that's a really big conflict that has emerged as as the Canorian crisis wound down. Instead of the world seeing peace, it created only more disputes between the victorious coalition. That, sure, they beat the empire, but there's now so many questions about, what's the world going to look like after that? Who's going to govern the former imperial lands? What political faction should the new Canoria belong to? The ICO or the Aurelian Senate? And nobody can agree on anything, and it starts a seriously intense Cold War between the two powers. And these are powers with presences beyond Ulia, beyond this homeworld of humanity. They have colonies everywhere, and so these interstellar colonies join the Cold War as well and start arming, and so everybody's armed and everybody's really angry, and there's politicking at play on multiple levels of society, like at the highest levels in military affairs, in cultural affairs, in just everyday life. People hate the opposing side, and if they were to go to direct war, it would be a truly cataclysmic thing. The ICO hates causing damage to the environment, and I think there was something about the Aurelian Senate holding its wanting to hold its fire with nukes. So the risk of nuclear war is currently low, but anything can happen because there's just so many flashpoints across
Hmm.
the solar system where things could go so wrong. Obviously, we've mentioned the Canorian crisis extensively because that's the biggest change in borders in over 2 centuries on anywhere in this world, which has just been so static and consolidated behind superpowers. So yeah, the Republic of Laronia, which was invaded by the Empire, is now occupied by Aurelian Senate forces for the most part. There's also some ICO presence in the south, and that's complicated by radical nationalist terrorists in the Republic of Laronia who hate the Empire, hate its people, and want to expel anyone speaking the foreign tongue of the Empire. So they attack Ionian occupation forces, which, as Eagle mentioned, are culturally very similar to the Empire. And that's led now to a major diplomatic spat between the Laronian government and Ionia. So it's going to seem to me like that will be a major conflict point because it's very, very complex. Republic of Laronia technically still exists even though it's under occupation because the occupiers want some sense of legitimacy and want it to seem like they're going to leave eventually, even though, of course, everyone wants territory to buffer themselves against the other side. But that's happening in Laronia. Also going on where a major point of conflict, of crisis could arise is between Astavara, which we've already said is an ICO ally, and Curvia, which is a Aurelian Senate ally. And you can see by this map, Astavara has very unique borders. And that's because has recently tripled in size owing to the collapse of the Canorian Empire. The western provinces of the Canorian Empire spoke Astavaran, or were culturally Astavaran for the most part. It was a strong minority to a narrow majority in the western provinces. So after the empire fell, much of its western presence was ceded to Astavara, which is now much bigger. However, it wants more. It's got a taste of that sovereignty and wants to unite all of its people under a single government, which has led to conflict because, as you can see by this map, after the fall of the empire, Palmaria has been squatting on some ethnically Astavaran land centered around the city of Kamst, which Astavara, this new revolutionary state, desperately wants. And even more than that, Astavara has its eyes set on a large chunk of neighboring Curfia, which has a Astavaran presence, an Astavaran majority even. It's called Ustarafa, but nationalists call it South Astavara, and those nationalists in the government want that area to be a part of this new state. So an active war is actually happening right in this region, and it's probably one of the biggest flashpoints because an ICO ally is directly battling a Aurelian Senate ally for territory, and it's a hot war. People are getting killed, and both sides are being supplied with weapons by the superpowers. So if the escalation ladder were to be climbed, it could be very easily climbed in Astavara.
I think that one's an interesting conflict for sure, for a great many reasons, but also because, at least in the microcosm, it's sort of disproven the whole theory of mutually assured destruction for both sides, because Astavara is nuclear armed via its allies in Kokonos, which is a neighboring country, and Curfia is nuclear armed via its allies in Palmaria, and still you have this direct land invasion of Curfia and a Palmarian occupation zone by a directly ICO armed nation, and nuclear weapons still have not been fired.
That is very interesting. I think there's a lot going on that is keeping these nations from strongly considering the nuclear option.
Yeah, but you could, that the failure of the major powers to deploy nuclear weapons in any capacity could potentially lay open the doors to a wider conflict between more major powers. There's also an interesting thing there of Astavara annexing majority Astavaran lands in Canoria, which the ICO wholeheartedly supported, and so did Pulmaria. But then you have the ICO stringently denouncing Ionian annexations of culturally similar lands in Canoria.
Yes, there's a lot of interesting sort of moral complexity and hypocrisy involved in this conflict because it all started with the ICO approving of the empire to annex its neighbor, Valoran.
Mm-hmm.
And now Astavara, this new state, is annexing ethnically similar lands in Valoran, and the ICO is
Yeah,
okay with that. So it's just like, but they again, like you said, denounce the Pulmarian Alliance states' annexation of imperial lands. So it's sort of a rules for thee, but not for me situation.
yeah,
And both sides are guilty of this. Like,
yeah. It's interesting to see the hypocrisies of both sides.
I think it does a good job of it mirrors our real world in that sense. Like states,
It humanizes the forces to some degree.
yeah, they ultimately have very pragmatic, like there's a disconnect. I'm interested in the disconnect between what states tell themselves and between their words and actions, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, that Astavar thing is super interesting. That deserves a video of its own too, frankly.
Oh, totally.
That's
Especially once the books come out, both yours and SV's, which I am very
oh,
excited for.
SV is
If
also writing. Yeah,
if
writing.
and when it comes out.
Yeah, he's rather stalled. The Astavaran conflict has stalled SV's writing, unfortunately. SV Studios, by the way, is another member of Steam Wars, Soul Wars, this writing project, who will feature on this podcast because he indicated interest when I
Very
posted
excited
about
for
it.
that.
And I'm
He
excited
is
too.
one of, definitely one of the most influential and biggest contributors to the setting in like pretty much for what, like 2 years now, 3 years.
Yeah, it's been a while, man.
It's pretty insane.
Yeah, and just the longer it goes, the more detail we pile on. Like, I'm firmly believe we don't need to add new planets, new land, because we can infinitely detail what already exists.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and also it's funny because SV said we had arguments about like our historical influence on writing Astavara and the
Oh
war,
yeah.
and those were really good.
Those. Yeah. The arguments. I mean, I feel like the arguments are. Yeah, they're a core part of the Soul Wars experience at this point.
You have to argue about something.
Have you really written a detailed story if someone hasn't accused you of, it being completely nonsensical?
I guess not. Yeah, no. He recently said that those arguments made him think that I hate, what was it? Hate the Aurelian Senate or something? Which
I think so.
I don't actually hate it, SV. If you're listening, it's a very interesting organization. Anyways, we
Yeah,
mm,
I think it can be sometimes difficult to discern between stuff you say, like, as the perspective of your characters or nations, and then the things you believe as the writer of those
yes,
entities.
that's frankly why I haven't been talking as much in the server because I don't want to say things as me that people will think will influence the books, you know.
Mm.
And I've probably taken that too far, but because I'm not talking
Well,
very much at all, but
I think once the first book releases, people have a general idea of how your perspective does or does not influence the actual goings on of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, that'll help
Yeah, for sure.
alleviate some of that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's many,
Anyway,
many more points of conflict between these two superpowers, which we will be getting into. I think the conflict itself could deserve its own video, but
yeah.
because frankly, that's the political core of the books. The books feature a lot of
Mhm.
politicking, which we mentioned early in the episode, but they do feature more elevated, abstract, esoteric, mystical, Lovecraftian arcs and threats too. Like while these forces are politicking for control of these planets, darker forces are awakening. Oh, and the timer just went off again and scared me. But yeah, dark forces are awakening. Stop that. Okay, it's it's not a good time to live in this
Yeah.
setting.
I can't believe we forgot to mention it. We were talking much earlier in this episode about how Soul Wars is sort of a fantasy setting transported into the future. And besides there being a multitude of different species, there is also magic,
Yes.
which is, it's, at this point, within the setting, it's considered just a science, more or less, or
Mm-hmm.
rather, magic is split into like multiple different sciences. So you have their official names as thaumaturgy, as but it's still like enchantments and inscriptions and casting spells and all that. It's just
Right.
more understood now that it's been so long, but it's still very much an esoteric and Lovecraftian art, and it's kept to a pretty select, uh, I guess, collection of groups, many of which now have influential posts in government or dedicated military intelligence wings.
Yeah. But yeah. Syad. Very interested to see
Yeah,
what you think of my take on Syad in the books.
I am very curious to see that because I think Syed has so many opportunities as both a faction sort of upholding what they view as the right path for the ICO while also politicking for their own gain and whatever their esoteric, strange, mystical, almost cult-ish their own goals might be.
Yeah. They function as a very interesting political faction and a very interesting magical faction that can directly interact with the conflict as a subset of the ICO, while also interacting with the weirder, deeper parts of the world that don't often bubble to the surface for many of our characters,
Yeah, definitely.
which is certainly going to be a lot to talk about with that, deserving of its own episode for sure, but after the books come out.
Right, of course.
Uh,
But in the meantime, I think, I mean, looking at the main page, I think pretty much every major ongoing arc we could probably dedicate an episode to.
Honestly, yeah, that sounds really fun.
I think that would be a good way of handling things because I think if we tried to tackle multiple, we wouldn't be able to actually expand on them in their full
No,
detail.
no, not at all. Okay. Yeah, that works for me. I think we
Great.
can say this will be the start of a series on the major arcs because the books will cover, of course, the overarching conflict between the ICO and the Aurelian Senate. All other conflicts are wrapped up within that conflict to some extent, but you
Mhm.
must understand how they all interact with each other. You need to
Yeah, and
understand
the
to get the
histories
greatest
behind them.
experience. Yes, yes.
And we hope that that's the experience that we can provide through this series, which I'm very excited to further elaborate on.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to cut our first episode here.
Yeah,
We'll edit it and get it up on the channel, and hopefully very soon after have some videos going into greater depth about these specific arcs. We've talked in a pretty general, abstract sense in today's episode. Like, we haven't zeroed in as much, except about the Canorian crisis, which I did appreciate. That deserves its own video too, frankly, but it can be later down the line.
Yeah, I went into maybe a little too much detail, but even then, I mean, I could go into a whole lot more detail just on that alone and how it's affected what's happening now.
Yeah. Truly
But
the Empire,
anyway,
most important nation in the Aurelian system.
so true.
It's the
But
fulcrum on which the world rests.
We haven't even talked about the fulcrum.
The
We didn't
fulcrum
mention
hasn't
it
come up once. First mentioned Crazy Pull. That'll come up, I'm sure.
But if, to our listeners, if there is any arc or topic like the world's religions or its like exotic materials or anything like that, its technology or specific nations or regions or peoples or any of the major arcs, if there's any of those you specifically want us to talk about, please let us know. Or if you have any feedback in general.
Definitely, yeah. I'd love to get feedback on the format of this show. And anything Eagle just said is absolutely fair game. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. But also, if there's any specific character you want to know more about, especially after
definitely.
the books.
Yeah, I'd like to... I mean, there are so many characters that... And I'd like to actually flesh them out more. I think it would be great to have a more character-driven Soul Wars, which is exactly what the books are doing, which is amazing.
What I like about them, yeah. Once the first one is out, I'm honestly hoping and praying for some tier lists and character studies and character analysis.
All of the ICO characters are going in S tier.
All of the what characters?
All of the ISO.
Oh no.
ICO characters.
All the blues get S. Okay, good to know. Yeah. But that's basically it. Like you said, just give us feedback in the comments and we'll talk about what you want us to talk about. There's lots to explore with this setting. I'm excited to go on this journey with you, Eagle.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to go on it as well.
Sweet. Well, with that, everybody, leave a like and subscribe if you want to support the podcast. We'll be seeing you very soon.